host, Richard Ellis. How are you doing today, Richard?
Greetings, Pearson. Greetings from the new year.
Yes, it is 2025. And in lieu of that, we aren't starting with good news because the year just started. So who knows what is afoot in this year of 2025. We're just going to skip right through and start this baby freestyle. So how was your New Year's celebration? Was it quiet or did you do something fun?
Yeah, when we talk about me having a good time over the holidays, we're using a different rubric than most people would have. Most people would think that a holiday spent in seclusion and avoiding everybody would be a miserable holiday. Not this one. That's the kind of holiday I can really go for. And I had people that tried to invite me places, and I avoided those invitations as well.
That's good. I mean, I can completely relate as a parent because we're just around these barbarians that are yelling in the background so much that, like a couple hours of seclusion would be great, or quietness. I think technically me and my wife did make it to midnight this time, unlike most of the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 New Year's, only because I passed out somewhere around 10:30 and then woke up on the bed around like 11:45, and she happened to have woken up too at the same time. And we were like, yeah, it's New Year's. Haha, we did it. So yeah, it was great.
There's a trend in the population in the city that I used to live in. This is a city in the Willamette Valley of Oregon.
Okay.
It's a little north of Salem for the crowd that likes to look at atlases and maps. And the population there has an affinity for fireworks. And so it's Beirut in the summertime.
Yes.
In gaps between the sheeting rainstorms, they like to come out and set off a few mortar rounds.
Yeah.
And I had made the mistake of being down there not at the time that one would actually start reasonably setting off fireworks, but 7 p.m. Because it's already pitch dark out here. We're living in the northern hemisphere. It's wintertime, and we're just a little past the solstice. So it's the one. This file this under wah. Vets don't like listening to mortar rounds going off outside of their house.
Yes.
Also,
vets and dogs also usually are not a big fan.
Any creature that has a sensitive nervous system would hate fireworks going off if they weren't involved in the fireworks. And so setting them off in city limits has got to be the most ghastly and horrible thing that anyone can do. And yet my neighbors in that particular town that I'm not mentioning right now are ghastly and horrible for that reason.
Yeah, we had a crazy show down here as well. There was an exorbitant amount of fireworks going off someplace nearby. I was surprised just because it hasn't been that way the last couple years. So I don't know what event or what billionaire paid for something to blow up a bunch of shit, but they did. It wasn't the mortar rounds, though. It's more of the traditional, pop, crackle. So those are a little bit less obnoxious, especially since they come in, a rapid succession. So you're like, oh, those are fireworks, not the random neighbor. I mean, Oregon is very notorious. I mean, it is during 4th of July in Southeast Portland. It's the Wild West. They're just letting off shit. And it's not even the 3 days before 4th of July or 3 days after. It's like weeks before. It's like the whole month of July, a little bit before in June. It's game on for fireworks in Oregon for sure. Very annoying with all the trees, the grass, the greenery that can be, on fire and all that stuff. Yeah, not a big fan either. So I'm sorry you had to experience that.
The one evening I spent incarcerated, beyond, how do they say that? It was against my will.
Yeah.
Was an evening in the middle of July 10 years ago where someone thought it would be a good idea to set off an enormous firework in their backyard that I could hear not through earbuds because I had those in, but the over-ear earmuffs as well because I was running a chainsaw when it went off.
Oh my God.
And they set it off next to my head. and that had a cascading series of events that um, I would, in a different history, I would call very shameful for me, but it ultimately set me on the path that I've been on to
Well, at least you
to
didn't do anything.
heal from PTSD.
At least you didn't do anything crazy with that chainsaw, I imagine, since it was only one night in jail. I'm just going to make an assumption. So that's good on the optics side. You're like, I had a chainsaw and a reason to use it.
Let's just say that if you don't have a history as a veteran, or not a dog yourself, or would otherwise be terrified by having explosions going off in your proximity as a consequence of living in a war zone, think about it before you let off that thing that is probably illegal in almost every circumstance except for a sanctioned pyro event.
Yeah, I mean, my wife and her family, my wife, her first 5 years of her life, the Iraq Iran war was still ongoing, and so bombs going off
Yeah.
and sirens happening and them having to seek shelter under tables. These were like common things for the first
Yep.
years of her life as well, too. Um, it might have been too early for her. She doesn't seem to have adverse reaction to the explosions, particularly like you would imagine. But that is, there's people who've definitely experienced that as well on the different and on the civilian side too. So
I guess that her family system was supportive in a way that when unsettling things happened, or things that we would call traumatizing things happened, that
yeah,
they had a way of creating safety immediately afterward.
there were lots of aunties, cousins, and figure and people around during these things happening. So yeah, I
Yeah.
believe that there was a really healthy support structure. This is a really good. I think you've kind of bridged a good opening talking about this to kind of go into veterans generally not handling explosions well. We've had some incidents recently in the news where some veterans
Mhm.
have come have put themselves in the spotlight, frankly, for some horrific things, and then one for what clearly both seem to be mental health driven.
Mhm.
It looked like both of the men who performed at one was far less. He killed himself and his truck blew up. It looks like uh, early reports on that was he was a Green Beret, and his wife left him or divorced. A couple days prior.
Mhm.
Same with the other guy who ran into some people, but that was a far more destructive show of the mental health breakdown. I've also had some recent conversations with some of my buddies who are struggling around this time.
Yeah.
One of them, with relationship, a couple of them with relationship based things.
Mhm.
Some must be in the frequency of the air these days or something there. And the other one who's just, we had talked recently, and he said that he had been diagnosed with PTSD a couple of years ago, and because he had had
Mhm.
kind of a couple of panic attacks or anxiety attacks, and um, he of course didn't think he had PTSD, which is like got to be the most. It's so memeable at this point as a veteran,
Yeah.
not thinking you have trauma. Mainly because they're always comparing it to some fictitious
Right.
or even a buddy you had that just went through more shit, went through more deployments, maybe got blown up, or whatever. They had a more extreme experience, and he was another one of those guys who was like, hey, I just thought mine wasn't that bad. Like my deployment was fine. But anyways, we talked recently, and he was saying he thought what for him what the trigger was is the helplessness of the rules of engagement. So
Yeah.
I went to basic with him. So we were later on after 2001 is when the Iraq conflict kicked off again. I, I should say since your Desert Storm, the earlier conflicts, it wasn't that
Well,
one.
you're referring to the beginning of the engagement of the global war on terrorism.
Hmm.
The the invasion of Iraq took place in the spring of 2003.
That's right, 2003. So yeah, so 2001 and then 2003 and the subsequent years after. From all accounts of my older veteran buddies and people who were in longer, it was a lot more Wild West. The rules of engagement were far less restrictive and allowed for more dynamic action on our point. To put this in military words of that make it agnostic from anything like death, kill. But by the time I joined in 2010, in September 2010, and so did he and everybody else I went to basic with. So we were kind of a later crew, and anybody who did have deployments by then, the rules of engagement had become really restrictive. And he was talking about how terrifying it was to see enemies on like the rooftops of buildings, like getting ready to take aim at you. And if they didn't have an RPG, it was just, an AK or something like that. Like you had to wait to see muzzle flash, like watch them aim down at your direction and fire at you before, and that helplessness and then worrying like, am I going to spend the rest of my life in Leavenworth because I chicken out and I take a shot first at the guy who's about to shoot at me that I know is going to shoot at me, but I have to wait for. And so we kind of talked about that psychology because I think that's what he said really got him. But anyways, recently he had a kind of a panic attack and a relapse, he said, of his PTSD. I wouldn't call it a relapse. This is just, it's built into the system, that he's working through. Right. So sorry, that's a long setup for, kind of where my thought process has been recently has been on veterans a lot lately. There's been a lot of veteran news. So I figured this was a good place to kick it all off as I ramble.
I don't know that I can spend a lot of time addressing this idea of the trauma measuring contest, but it's one of the aspects of what we would call a post-event life. So I'll do one distinction, which is there are people who suffer from chronic traumas that took place over a long period of time, and those are usually those fit into the category of complex PTSD, or sometimes it's also referred to as childhood PTSD. So those are the types of things that I talk about in this forum because they occur to me.
Yes, we have both discussed our childhood trauma.
To you.
Yes.
And so when it's complex, what that is noting is that it oftentimes was chronic and drawn out. It was things that if you talked about a single incident, you'd say like, well, I mean, bad stuff happens to people. That sounds pretty low key. But when you compress that into for many people, a 16 or 17 year period where it happened every day and it happened in a variety of ways that were all unpredictable, you have this much more life-altering experience than if it was one single event. Then when you have service members, every one of us will say, well, I wasn't in the convoy that got shot up and carried out of there on a stretcher and then spent the rest of my the last 20 years recovering from bone fragments, right? We'll say, well, that wasn't me. But what we have very little experience with in our culture, and certainly the vets that we interact with, they won't put together that part of what got them part of what got them to enlist in the service in the first place might very well be a complex traumatic past.
Yeah.
And so when they have these acute experiences, it's now very additive.
Yes. I completely agree. I mean, we've discussed this. You and I have discussed this ad nauseum, the idea that you are a moth to the flame when it comes to enlisting into the military, if you've experienced the complex trauma that you're discussing. It's and I think that's one thing. And then also military service, there's a lot of aspects of that um, mirror some of the worst parenting behaviors that might have inflicted complex PTSD or complex trauma to begin with. And so that isn't just one event. Those are multiple events, right? Like always, I remember in the Q course specifically, there's so many different classes that are moving around that even your class, like based on if you were on hold or if you're just going through and people are failing classes constantly. So you're kind of getting mixed and shuffled as you progress through the Q course. You have a lot of different phases. There's language phase, there's small unit tactics, there's survival, the survival portion, all this stuff. During these phases, you're switch groups all the time, but because of that, there's brand new guys showing up and they have barely been soldiers for like 3 months and they're fucked up. And so there's always someone fucking up when you're in these formations. But even if you've never seen that guy in your entire life, you're all of a sudden responsible for policing his bad behavior, but you should have policed it before you ever knew him, right? There's this like this catch-22, which it comes from the military as a term, of constant fear, of living in constant fear. And then you go and you're deployed to wherever, and if there's explosions or IEDs going off, or you're going outside the wire, or even your fob is being attacked, regularly by a mortar round here and there. We're not properly calibrating what it's like to live under that that constant low pressure of fear that permeates maybe a deployment or just generally your experience of being in the military and kind of having to be on guard. And then there's all the other social issues of barracks life and stuff that people have to navigate. There's a lot of issues with mental health that's there. There's predators in the military, just like anywhere else, and rape and all these things are a problem as well. So there's a lot of fear baked into this, and I don't want to paint a picture that the military is just this fear embroiled situation, but there are aspects to it that can trigger those complex childhood traumas that you're bringing up. So
a feature of a complex traumatic history. It's a feature, by the way. It's not a bug. It is a predictable outcome of complex childhood history, complex traumatic history, is a kind of destruction of a person's authentic self. Their authenticity is eroded in service of attachment. And I've when we've talked about this in the past, I've mentioned the physician Gabor Mate, who's written about this and has. If you search what's that called? Oh yeah, YouTube. You'll find all kinds of different presentations that he's given on this idea that the central conflict in our development is between attachment and authenticity. And authenticity is on the losing side of family systems that Pierce and I have come from. And so what's also a destruction of one's authenticity is also a feature, not a bug. I'm phrasing this wrong. I should come back and try it again. In the military, the destruction of one's authenticity is also a feature, not a bug.
Oh, and it's part of the directive. They need to flesh out authenticity.
The less of an individual you are, the better your performance in a unit and the better you function, which is the rationale behind, as Pierce was mentioning earlier, when you have someone who messes up they're a part of your unit, but they keep acting in some authentic or individual way. They're not conforming to unit behavior very well. What happens is what has been described as not being a part of the military, it still is. It's called group punishment. And so we'll use the Private Pile analogy. If you haven't seen Full Metal Jacket,
Stanley
Kubrick, there are some upsetting scenes in it, and I caution you to go out and watch it. But there is a particular scene where this unit of recruits is being group punished because of the performance of the behavior of one Marine recruit. This I'm on this authenticity versus attachment feature, not a bug topic here because
Yeah.
when we think about those the strategies for reformatting the human psyche, it it I dare to say I absolutely agree with the idea that conformity in a military application, in a martial application, is ideal. The best possible thing that can happen is that everyone dresses exactly the same and behaves in highly predictable ways within the unit structure, because then every kind of play that a commander can make means that they'll have a very predictable outcome. So this is an engineering concept. This is engineering martial outcomes.
Yeah, and I think the nuance is we're not talking about the military as a whole necessarily because there are I mean the military is so vast and there's so many different branches and stuff, but when we're talking about the infantry unit or like
Yeah.
a marine fighting unit, a company of marines,
Yes.
each individual member, we need them to conform within that unit. And there can be room for some dynamic behavior within the officer
Mm-hmm.
corps and the non-commissioned officer corps. That's why we have both of those corps, and especially as we get up to the E6 and above rank,
Mm-hmm.
probably you can start to see there's a the U.S. is we're the best at this. We're very professional at this. We're amazing at logistics, and we are really good at discipline.
Yeah.
And it's because we have the NCO Corps as well as the
Yes.
officer corps. The NCO Corps allows for us to have echelons of conformity followed by small uh, pressure points. This would be like a corporal and slash team leader position, the
Mm-hmm.
E4, E5 ish position, but
Mm-hmm.
E5 NCO position allows for a small portion of dynamic control. They can make a
Mm-hmm.
decision of whether they're going to cut right or cut left, maybe go how they're going to stack on the door, small things like that, or how they're going to clear the room. The E6 is another echelon, that where they're going to have a little bit more control, and this goes all the way up in the military system, and it's important. So we do try to. I'm just trying to back up what you're saying, like
Yeah.
with some nuance, because it's really important to understand this from an infantryman's perspective. And then also, if we were talking about any special operations unit, all of this goes out the door again because the level of conformity is completely different, and there's a lot more dynamic behavior allowed. Whether we're talking about even the Rangers and how they do CQB versus like a Sephardic, special forces team, or SEAL Team 6, or whatever echelon we're talking about. There's going to be different levels. So there's a lot of nuance to what Richard is underneath what Richard's saying, general. But general military practice is like conformity allows for control from a strategic standpoint. Absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
right. And so this is this is all in service of this much greater mission and vision of defense.
Mm-hmm.
Where things go to pieces in our civilization is that only until very recently we have just the tiniest amount of improvement on this in the last 30 years. It's been so infinitesimally small. Do we have any kind of idea of what it means to leave that environment, having either served during a peacetime period, rare, or particularly served during a wartime period, much more likely, and the outcomes for every person who now has to reimagine what their existence is without that hive of conformity or those structures that keep them locked into a hierarchical position. You could move up or down in those positions, but that those hierarchical positions are sustained while you're in that level. And so we we would find ourselves out in, as we say, in the civilian world, and having to come up with how we function now in this utterly unregulated, unstructured, zero support system environment that we had adapted to, at least to the point where fitting in meant the least amount of compulsion and punishment. And
Yeah,
so when we go ahead, I was going to follow up on these crisis situations where we
no,
see vets making the news because they get in these
no, go
trouble. But
ahead.
go ahead, please.
Well, my thought was, and just quickly, I think what you're onto is a lot of these men, they are leaving with, they have their family structure potentially intact, like they get out of the military and they have their wife, maybe their kids. But I mean, with these men in the news, we see that their wives left them previously before
Yeah.
these incidents, right? And I can imagine when you're swimming in the sea of civilian life and trying to find structures, you still have this home base structure of your family unit potentially.
Mm-hmm.
We we having gone through a divorce, and you yourself also, we understand that it
Yeah.
could not be a perfect one, but it is some semblance of structure.
Yeah.
If that breaks down, I could see a lot of people's feeling lost in the wind after that, or floating in that sea that you speak of. So
And when we talk about, by the way, I would like to, if I need to even overemphasize this, in those scenarios where we have a service member and they have some tragic outcome, and then we say, "Oh, what happened preceding this? Oh, the wife left." This is never her fault. She did not cause this.
no.
A preceding event in this former service member's life was that their family system crumbled. Their family system was being propped up by whatever melange of uh, people in distress kind of bonding together in the distress, but
Yeah.
not necessarily. These are not the. There are veteran homes. Excuse me. There are homes where veteran service members are living with families, and there's this whole family system that are just like ideal. If you did a TV show where that was the through line of the every plot was centered around this, the conflicts would be nothing. There would be no TV show, right? There's just
Yeah.
it's too picturesque. There are families like that, and there are families with veterans that are like that. But many times the case is that what is happening in those families is that either both of them are complex trauma survivors. This is very frequently the case.
Yeah.
Or one of them is the service member. And without what for me has amounted to about 20 years of therapy and a huge amount of investigating, like on my
Yeah.
own, and trying out things like ballroom dancing to change how my mind works. These people are stuck in patterns that are cohesive in short bursts, but massively destructive in long-term applications.
Yeah.
And so when these family systems fall apart, essentially the other way to look at this is, imagine the conversations where there were women in the spouses. Let's say this is a male service member and a female spouse. This is oftentimes the case. There are women in the woman's friend sphere that are saying, "You got to get out of there. He's scary."
Yeah.
Because that's what happens to us. We get scary because we have these the window of tolerance concept is a great way to think about how this works, which is there'll be these moments where it's a period of hypo-arousal, in other words, really low arousal, really sedate kind of behavior, maybe checked out, maybe spaced out, maybe genuinely disassociated. And then something will happen that will be an inciting incident.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, that person is what you would call hyper aroused and engaging in the situation in a way that is disproportionate to its necessity. They
That
are
is the nicest way of saying overreacting.
yes, overreacting
and,
totally.
and I know I experienced this as well as you. like and I always see it too. Like without someone that helps co-regulate you, I would say
Yeah.
mine it would be Sarah, my wife. when it comes to that. She usually gives me the look like, hey, what the, like you need to tone it down because I'm like overreacting over something like spilled milk, essentially, and I don't do it that often, but when I do, she's always like, hey, and and then I'll be like, I'll try to stop myself, but then I'm like, I don't quite stop. And then she's like, hey, like, what the hell? And I'm like, okay, yeah, because I'll keep like, hey, what the is going on? Or if I'm yelling about, something dirty or whatever. And to the point where, and I recognize it in myself too. Like for me, a lot of times, Sarah's just like, hey, when the boys, because the boys are fighting now too, right? Like they fight because Keon's over 2 now, and they're boys. They fight over everything. Well, they're kids fight too. I mean, but like, God, they fight over everything. And it's like, so one's always hitting the other, and I'm like, hey, the little one's being defend. So I always, but these kids don't know how to deregulate. Me getting involved, I'm hyper aroused, as you would say, and like literally adding flames to the fire, basically. So Sarah's always like, hey, if I'm around, you never get to be the first reaction. And I do. Right. I stay out of it usually, unless like she's like stuck in the bathroom or, wherever she went to go visit her friend or, so most of the time, like I just am like, oh, I should just stay out of this completely, until things have settled down, then I can come in, and, but I completely get what you're saying. Like when it comes to this, those moments, they happen and more extreme. So what I would say is the advice of the women to the other women, they're not wrong. I mean, it is a dangerous situation potentially, especially if somebody is less mentally stable when this happens, right? When there's this hyper arousal happens. And I'm not saying all vets when they go under this are. I'm not like smacking my kids around or anything like that, but but there's definitely different degrees of this. It's super, and it's tricky because each person, it's individual and unique to the person's individual and unique experience. So
it takes an enormous amount of insight and desire for reflection and to have here's that magic piece that is impossible for nearly every one of us as vets to arrive at a point where we realize things are not working anymore. So have the aha moment.
Yes.
And then to be able to distance ourselves from every single possible antagonist and then spend 5 years working it out and then gradually adding antagonists back in and then like practicing coping with that. That is an impossibility for all but a 0.01% of the population. I'm the only one that gets to do this. And it just happens to be.
I would say I also am extremely lucky. Like when it comes to this too, like I've had time to reflect. I have someone to co-regulate with to allow me to have gone through, which is a huge key. And the desire, the kids adding fuel to the fire, the desire to like not fuck them up.
Right.
I mean, that's the big one. It's like, I don't want them to be, gunning for the military as like enlisted soldiers, like if they do, I know I'm like, well, I fucked up, so if they want to go in as officers, I'm like, okay, I didn't do too bad, I guess, but
yeah, you now have the hell of the being self-aware of what their outcomes mean as a reflection on you.
I mean, the tropes are, it's like if your son is like becoming a fighter, like if he's going to go be a fighter in the UFC, you fucked him up, by the way. If your daughter's she's going to go be a stripper or whatever, like, yeah, you effed up, right? There's these obvious ones that are out there. The enlisting in the Marines or the Army, like when I hear that, whenever I hear a parent, they're like, oh yeah, he's they enlisted. I can't help myself. It's an auto thought. I'm like, oh shit, you fucked your kids up. Like I immediately think like, especially when they're like, oh yeah, my kids enlisted the Marines or the Army. And I'm just like, oh, you fucked them up. Like I think about that. I'm like, or they'll talk to me. They're like, hey, my kid's thinking about joining. And I'm like, join the Coast Guard. I always tell them, tell your kid to join the Coast Guard. That's where they should go.
It's a fine career as an electrician in the Air Force.
Hell yeah. I mean, if they can get into the Air Force, go to the Air Force for sure. That's the place to be. They have the best chow halls and the best barracks. Everyone knows this.
There are absolutely what you would call securely attached and well-adjusted people who enlist in the armed forces and have wonderful experiences serving in those careers. Now that I have some time to reflect on it, that was not my experience, and it doesn't sound like it was yours. So we're doing a little bit of overgeneralization.
That's true.
Sure.
That's true. I'm sure there are well-adjusted enlisted members. I have yet to meet one. No, I'm sure. And by the way, all my friends are enlisted. I'm not friends with the single. I don't know any officers outside of like when I was in. Right? I'm like not talking to Captain so-and-so or Lieutenant blah, blah, blah. None. Like I don't associate with any of them. I think I have one as a Facebook friend. That's it. And so like, they're all enlisted. I love me some effed up enlisted members. Don't get me wrong. I mean, they're the funniest, best people at the end of the day, personally. They're my best friends. So, and you know, I'm one of them. So, you know, I think there's a freedom to talk. You know, I think it's healthy for us to talk about these things and like, yeah, to recognize we have these triggers, right? That hypo and that sense of like, because yeah, when you were talking about these veteran homes where, you know, they're super mundane and like you wouldn't want to film them because it would be boring, essentially is what you're saying, it'd be happy and boring.
Yeah.
That's generally my life, our home life at our house. You know, the conflicts are the boys hitting each other and fighting like normal boys. But, you know, yeah, it's just, we would be boring to film. Like there's not, it's, you know, the same stuff happening every day. And that's great. And I think what's great is I do hear a lot of veterans, as I hear struggling with mental health, there's plenty others I hear having similar conversation, like having enlightenment. They understand like, oh man, I did have some shit, you know, in my childhood that caused things to happen. We're always looking for those extreme versions of like something happening. And it's so hard to look at the nuance of the day to day of things happening in each other's lives. I think that's always the trickiest thing. You know, it's like when Assad fell, right? People are like, whoa, it just happened, right? We don't get to see like, oh, this was actually happening, you know, over the last 3 or 4 years amongst the rebel forces that were, you know, the Kurdish forces and the other rebels. We just don't see a lot of that sometimes. It's really hard to analyze the day to day, even in our own lives and even in the broader picture. So,
I'm disposed to comment on, but really to acknowledge that ideally there would be interventions. Ideally there would be a way to say, hey man, have you tried this to your veteran neighbor who's really struggling, or to your veteran friend who's really struggling? And I want to acknowledge that oftentimes the thing that would be best for them is outside of most of their neighbors and friends and family members' ability to handle. Because like literally the amount of experience I've had with therapy and reading on the subject of how the nervous system works, it's like I'm working on a bachelor's degree in social work.
Yeah.
And no one else would have that type of contact with the situation or the theories and concepts behind this unless they had a really serious reason to do it. So it's really hard to say, well, hey, look out for everybody and, you know, help them out if you see them. But there are these resources for us as vets. Some of them are harder to access. Some of them are easier or harder to access depending on the era of American history, for example.
Yeah.
And if you know someone in your life and there's local resources, if you notice it, I would go look at those local resources. That would be my recommendation if we were to say, how could we, prevent these tragic things from happening? If there was any way to stop it, it's to get an intervention that former service member, that vet, accepts as an authority in their lives.
Yeah.
And that can be, for this vet over here, that's a church. For this vet over here, that is someone from a veterans organization. For this vet over here, that might be someone they served with that outranked them. For them, that's the only answerable force in their lives. And
the vet with the shared experience helps too. I mean, at the end of the day, talking to your veteran friends when they're struggling and just letting them talk about what they want to talk about. I think that's huge. One of them, it was funny because he called me, and I didn't even think anything of it. This Christmas, it was just, my mom was in town and it was super busy. The kids were highly activated because grandma's there, for 10 days. And so they're just like not sleeping. They're up later. They're just off the walls. And so I'm all hands on deck, and I just didn't send out my usual better thought out Christmas greetings and New Year's greetings. And, basically to my circle of correspondence. And one of my buddies was like, oh, hey, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year and stuff. And I was like, you too, but it was like super short, but I gave it a heart. And he noticed the shortness. It was really funny too, because he was like, hey, you never say dude, you always say bro, what's up? Like, are you mad at, but he was going through his episode at the time and he was hypersensitive, and he was all like, hey man, like the language we use matters, like what's up? Like, and I was like, yo bro, like don't think anything of it. Like I'm straight up, but this was it. I was like, it's literally the two kids just call, I was like, I'm sorry, it was short, it was like, that was it. But then we had follow-up conversation too, because he was like, yeah, man, we need to talk more, and I was like, yeah, for sure. I think, just talking to each other really helps. I mean, you and I know that talking to each other has helped us over the years as we've gotten to know each other. I have benefited a lot personally from our conversations. Even if they didn't have much to do necessarily directly with mental health or even our past, Oregon upbringing. Yeah, it's like weird Oregon upbringing. Yeah.
Well, the highest form of speech that we can aspire to participate in is the speech of ideas, the interchange of ideas. It's where we get a concept about something that we think would matter or would be a positive force in the world and talk about those things. To say that gossip is the lowest form of speech suggests that I'm, throwing shade, but gossip does something in the immediate foreground. Like that is a way for people to kind of connect over a common foe, but it doesn't do us that much good long term the way that ideas does us a lot of good long term.
Gossip's a good segue, like a opening drink, when you're starting a conversation. It's good to as long as it gets you where you're trying to go. It could be a vehicle, but it should be an Uber and not something you're driving across the country with, if I try to carry this analogy, if that works.
In the tortured analogy, it's Ubers compared to transcontinental railroads and airports that we're trying to build infrastructure for.
Yeah, exactly. So
I guess there was one other thing I was going to mention on this. How do we intervene if possible? But really, I live in a neighborhood now where I really don't know anyone in this neighborhood, and I lived in a neighborhood where for 10 years I didn't know anyone in that neighborhood, and I'm reflecting on how difficult it could be to try to make contact with someone like myself who's so deliberately misanthropic. And I think that I know what I was going to get into. That and I'm talking about this misanthropy as kind of like it gets worse the more burned out I get. The less gas I have in the tank, the more misanthropic I am. And I
Yeah.
was noticing that over the break. This was floating around in my mind when you were talking about contact, having that exchange with your friend. I didn't do anything. I took 2 weeks off from work. I didn't do anything, quote unquote.
Hmm.
I stayed home. I worked on projects. By day 4 of not going into work was when I finally realized how absolutely fried I was from the preceding year. How
Yeah.
absolutely scorched to a crisp I was. And I it's so difficult to admit that I'm burned out from my career and things that are going on peripheral to that because I've tried to really make it so that everything I do these days is something I like to do.
Yeah.
I love my job. Pierce knows that I
Yeah.
thrive at work. It's a really great place. I work at a university, for goodness sakes. The good that we're doing is self-evident to everyone who works there, and
Yeah.
it's felt by everyone who works there.
Well,
And
and you've really carved out a position where you're integral to the success of a lot of new students who are going off to
yeah,
do a lot of things, and you've managed to do that in a way where you get to do a lot of what you want to do, and that's a
yes,
super cool, unique thing. That's a unique thing that you've allowed
yeah,
to do, and so it's kind of like you've built a position out for yourself that they'll be hard pressed to replace if they ever have to now, because God, you're actually going to have to start creating a profile for what your job looks
yeah,
like on a side note. Um, but you can be burnt out because it's just been a busy year, and
totally.
I mean, this Christmas went by in such a flash. I thought my mom was only here for 3 days. It felt like she was here for 3 days. It was 10, but it was like,
Yeah,
oh, Christmas is done. And my mind, I was like, I don't remember much of it because it was such a blur. Things
hmm
happened. We have pictures. It was great. I
hmm
remember generally it was fun. I cooked a lot.
hmm
Um, I gained 10 pounds easily worth of sugar in like a month, which is evident as I look at my face right now. So yeah, Christmas happened, the holidays happened, New Year's happened, but it just, I totally feel you on like, yeah, you can still be burnt. I love my job currently too. Completely different situation, but I feel like I've carved out a kind of a unique position for myself here as well, and I'm very much enjoying it. They could pay me more, but besides that, I love everything else about my job. Essentially, I even like my managers and stuff like that. Like it's all gravy right now, and the work I'm doing is awesome. So yeah, you were feeling burnt, dude. You were toasted to
totally.
a crisp. Um, yeah, toasted to a crisp, doing what you love.
I finally was able to get that into my mind as that was kind of was going on, and um, I'm loath to really get into this other part, but I want to acknowledge that um, I had been noticing a lot of fatigue, like throughout the year. It just felt like it was year 3 of a 18-month period of my life. It just felt
Yeah,
dragged out, and how was it already, name of month? I thought it was 3 months earlier, name of month, whatever, however you want to imagine it,
yeah,
that it was never in my life have I ever had the experience or need to leave work, come home, take a nap. I'm 47. I'm not that old, truly.
did it? We read that article. Well, go ahead. Sorry, but anyways,
Do one activity in the evening, dance, which I know is a physical activity, but it's not that physically demanding,
Yeah.
and then come home and be annihilated for the rest of the evening, but really not be able to go to sleep because, there's a complex chemistry going on here. And this had been going on for the better part of 2 years. And this whole time I just kept trying to conceptualize, oh, am I still healing from that surgery? Well, that's 3 years ago now. Am I
Yeah.
still recovering from this thing? Well, that's right. And I'm just gonna dabble in this a little bit and mention that I get blood drawn every 6 months as a part of the post oncological treatment regime.
Yeah.
So every 6 months, I see an oncologist. I get a blood panel. They look at it and they go, "You're as healthy as a horse, Richard. Smack me on the ass and send me back out into the rodeo grounds," right?
Hey
And
yo.
so the whole time I'm thinking, well, there can't be anything medically wrong with me.
But did we read this article or talk about it where they said that
Yeah.
the two ages that are felt
Yep.
the most, and you just said
Yes.
2 years ago, the average is 44, that age,
Yep.
which, I mean, you're
Yep.
47 now, so 2 years ago, the math is checking out.
Totally.
And then something like 64, 64,
Yeah.
65. Those are the two ages that most, after that, you start to feel a next level of,
Yeah.
and it's funny because I feel like my mother-in-law, she's been talking about this too a lot, where she's been working hard. She works retail. It's the holiday season, and when she gets done with, she got sick a lot more this last couple of years than she's ever been before. She's past 64 now, and also the grandkids around, my little disease factors, are here doing the same thing. And but after she got sick this last time, she had to do something she hadn't done in her whole life. She took a week off to recover,
Yeah.
a whole week
Yeah.
to sleep. And she just realized, she's like, I'm just sleeping and I'm so tired. And she just needed to catch up on like what felt like years worth of rest. Right.
Yeah.
And it's funny because, and I don't know if it's because I like to introspect about these things, but even I'm only 39 and I keep thinking, I was like, am I going to be aware of when this hits? Like how, and I keep thinking, like, every time I trip now too, like, or I catch myself, I'm like, I'm in the prime of my life. If I'm 70, I can't be this casual about this. I need to be more cautious as I get older about this stuff. Because if I go to catch myself, there's a wrist broken. If I go to do this, you could just break your hip, right? And then, I had that thought, and I'm like, I need to just be aware of like my age, I guess, in this weird way. But that momentum of just adding to you're not a young buck anymore, I guess, that's part of it.
I requested you'd think that if you're going to see an oncologist and you have their blood panel, that you're getting a above and beyond medical experience. That is correct, but what that means is that they're deleting some of the more casual family medicine
tests
tests and interventions. And so I finally do the thing which is like, okay, I want to acknowledge that this country has a wildly out of whack medical system, if you could even call it that. It's not a system per se. If it was a system, at least it would be universally broken. I'm going to acknowledge that right now.
Yeah.
And that somehow, mercifully, inexplicably, I happen to luck into one of the good ones. I want to acknowledge that is the case here.
Yeah.
So when I say, oh, I made an appointment with my family physician, I get that there are parts of this country and there are people that will hear this who are like, oh, must be nice. What are you, royally or something?
Yeah.
No, it turns out that there is just a wildly diverse experience in this country, and it has highs and lows.
Even within Kaiser Permanente, I have Kaiser in Oregon versus Kaiser in NorCal. Completely different experiences, different cultures of Kaiser. Yeah. Anyways, go ahead.
So I got a blood panel, and the results that come back, I can look at them. We live in
Yeah.
we live in this wild age where some things work really well that are electronic and software, and some things are garbage
Yeah.
currently. Like, I don't know, I might have mentioned a piece of software that we're using today that I have to restart my computer to use. Anyway, so I look at it, and basically the summation of all of the blood work is just that, oh, I'm old, and I'm out of shape and overweight. It's like, oh, thanks. Thanks in medical science.
E- I'm having deja vu to. I think I explained this when I did my first panel when I started at my job because they do the health screening and they did
Yep.
I had to get the full panel. And it was like, well, you're overweight for your height and your blood sugar's too high. You know,
Yep, nailed
it,
it.
and it was like, so that. And yeah,
Up
so
until I up until my medical journey began when I was 42, my blood pressure was always lower than average. None
yeah.
of the soluble fats in the blood were present. There was no glucose problem. And then, yeah, here we are, right? I've crossed that Rubicon of age. And so, okay, what does this mean? Am I going to have to start eating vegetarian again? Am I going to have to start doing all these things? Um, we're probably at the end of our program's length right now, but I want to mention that um, so I can simultaneously hold in my mind the ability to criticize and denigrate um, what we would call alternative health care,
Sure,
and at
homeopathy.
the and at the same time really criticize and denigrate modern Western medical interventions, because
They
if
both
you
have
yeah,
problems in their own
if
way.
you
Yeah,
actually interrogate things like this, you can kind of see the problems that are inherent. Um, for example, in order to even begin the treatment regime that ultimately became a major feature in my life in 2018, I had to go to our emergency room. And it was the second visit to the emergency room following a CT scan that was finally recommended by somebody that actually began, oh, this yokel has cancer.
yeah,
So these are difficult things to diagnose until you have the actual diagnostic tools to apply it, and these are expensive and oftentimes avoided by health systems because they want to keep costs down.
yeah.
And so when I say I go to an acupuncture therapist, I went to an acupuncture therapist for a decade before it began to do anything, and it only began to do anything because I began to change other parts of my life.
Yeah.
So you can say, well, I'm having these interventions here, these interventions here, and what are they even doing? Well, almost everything is much more to do with your day-to-day lifestyle than it has anything to
Holistic.
do with,
Yeah.
yeah, totally. And I was complaining about this energy level, and I was grossing about, oh, now I'm old and fat, blah blah blah, the blood panel. And my acupuncture therapist finally says, well, you've been through a chemotherapy treatment, and she treats other people with these same
Yeah.
conditions. She says, I want to propose to you that you try this digested enzyme supplement. And I'm like,
Mm.
that's all dirt.
Mhm.
So you know that I was unwilling to try it at first because of my cynical, critical thinking nature.
Mhm.
Um, what I want to say is consult your physician or your voodoo dini or your witch doctor or your acupuncture therapist.
Your crystals, whatever.
But my goodness, was that a total change for me? And
Really?
so
Oh.
so that burnout is not just because I was working every day and having a lot of meetings and doing all these things that my job entails. my burnout wasn't just because I had some pretty severe medical treatments that spanned the better part of 4 years.
Yeah.
My burnout wasn't this, it wasn't that, it wasn't because I'm 45, it wasn't because, right, it's, right, you have a gestalt, you have a whole picture.
Yeah.
But one of the most important takeaways from that, and we'll see, I mean, the way that I feel today versus when I started my break is a night and day difference. But I'm also skittish about adding a bunch of things back into my life again because that
Yeah.
break was um, transformative. But one of the things that had been going on was that uh, prior to my cancer journey, my diet was fairly diverse. I had a cast iron gut, as people would say. Um, I would eat a variety of things, and probably the smallest part of my diet was meat of any kind. And following that cancer journey and following all these interventions and treatments and different types of drug regimes and so forth and so on, my diet shrank to about three things. Because anything other than those three things was a journey of discomfort.
Yeah.
And what what this gut health uh, insight here is that you know that whole part of our body works in a way that when it's working fine, it's invisible to us. But because of its invisibility of function, when it stops working fine, we have no way of understanding how to diagnose it as individuals. And
And it's
physicians, it
the most
turns out,
complex system too. I mean, digestive system's a
yeah,
huge, that's a big book. It's way bigger
turns
than
out
like cardiovascular's like this big. Digestive's like this big.
it's a it is a ballet, a symphony of teamwork between your human DNA, non-human DNA, and the
Probiotics.
products between the two different genetic lines of organisms working together to process a third genetic line of material organisms that you're processing.
Yeah.
And so the digestive enzyme was this whole thing that I really hadn't factored in this whole time because I tried this biome, this gut biome thing. I tried this. Now I'm eating more yogurt. Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to mention this kind of at the end of our discussion that I did. I showed up to my last oncology check-in. I'm good to go for a year now. They're giving me the year extension as opposed to every 6 months.
Nice.
And of course, when my oncologist said, "Well, how are you feeling?" and they always have to ask, "How's that gut working?" I pulled out of my bag and here's the bottle. Read the label, please. And please factor this into your recommendations to your future patients. Because this is a problem, and magically, this is now making a difference that nothing else was doing for me.
Yeah. That's amazing. Well, that's a probably possibly annoying thing to find out after, so long of like
Yeah.
cutting short your diet. And I hope that allows you to diversify your diet more. I'm guessing that's what it's allowing you to do, which will overall benefit your health, considering that
Yes.
we are omnivores. We do eat, diversity does help our gut biome, actually. That's part of the gut biome thing. So
Mm-hmm.
that's really cool. And it, it's it's cool because we'll see how things go, but that unlock allows for other things to get moving too.
Mm-hmm.
I would say when it comes to like feeling low on energy, we've talked about it. I felt the same way. It's like it's that you do exercise, oh, you have more energy. It's the whole comprehensive thing. The big thing I always say is like sometimes it's the small changes that matter, like the small addition to your diet that could change a lot of things. The addition of a walk to your normal schedule to get some more activity going that's different than maybe dancing or whatever. Those kind of things
Yeah.
can just like really help a lot. And so I'm really happy to hear that you had this experience and that You took the homeopathic approach when it was necessary. We use Nosin and Zicam. That's a homeopathic thing we have. And I also got vaccinated. So, boom. I completely understand the diversity there. So,
Oh, I'm feeling very smug having gotten my flu vaccine this fall.
I got it
Got
too.
right in there in September, got that taken care of, and oh yes, there were people around me being felled by that disease.
Same in my own house. I got the flu vaccine and I got COVID. I don't think the COVID one worked because I definitely got COVID, but the flu one definitely worked. Or maybe the COVID one like minimized it or whatever. I don't know. Anyways, but the flu one definitely worked. So, hey, happy to start the 2025 off with an episode. We'll get this released as quickly as possible, and happy to see all of you guys back here. I was going to ask, should we have people email in if they want us to talk about whatever their veteran shit is?
Suggest topics?
Well, we were talking about how hard it is to gain access to to talk to other veterans or something like that.
Yeah.
But like you could just email like, hey guys, this is what's going on. Keep it anonymous. And with my life, what do you think? And we can just talk about it, I guess. I don't know if that does anything. Should we have people email? Let's think about it on our break. Yeah. Well,
yeah, audience feedback has a rich history.
mm-hmm.
It has a functional and what we would say effective kind of range.
Yeah.
There will always be people who ask for things that are impossible, and there will always be people who don't think that their thing is meaningful and hold back when maybe it would be. So making that a request is probably a good idea, with the expectation that we're adding homework to our lives.
Yeah.
And also a certain amount of screening that is necessary for
a total amount of screening. I'm going to say, because there'll be a bunch of, anyways, something we could think about. I wanted to pose the question. We'll think about it and probably come up with an offline decision and let anybody who's listening know what we think, if we could talk about. And I just mean talk about whatever subject they bring up as far as like mental health. We'll weigh in with our opinions that are just from our experience. We're not mental health professionals or anything like that, but just if you need veterans to talk to in the ether, I suppose. So Richard, it's a pleasure. Can't wait to talk to you again. Have a good start of your January, man.
Right on, Pearson. It's great talking with you. Classes start next week. It's going to be back to not the grind, the rodeo. I'm back in the rodeo.
I like it. All right, man. Take care.
All right, dude. Talk to you later.